Hello and welcome everyone to our podcast. We are talking about subjects and topics that affect the citizens of Chico. I'm joined today with Tom Van Overbeek of the Chico City Council.
Good morning, Brett.
Hello, good morning. And today we have a really important topic. We are talking about homelessness, probably the biggest topic in Chico. So first off, Tom, just where are we at, the city of Chico, with the issue of homelessness overall?
Well, it's a mess, but it's not as big a mess as it was. But what we've done is allow the homeless to define the experience of living in Chico, and that's wrong.
Wow. We've let the homeless define the experience of living in Chico. That is powerful. So basically, who are the homeless? It's such a broad, I guess, population, but in general, who are they, and how many of them do we have here in our city?
So let me answer that second, but first I want to expand on what I said about letting the homeless define the experience of living in Chico.
Mm-hmm.
So I travel around the country quite a bit, and the problem we have with homelessness in Chico is unique to California, California and the West Coast.
Okay.
And the difference is when you go to places like Texas or the Midwest, you see a few homeless people, but they're not everywhere. And the difference is the cities and the states are run with the welfare of the majority of the citizens first. The quality of the civic life for the people who live in the town and have families and want their kids to ride the bikes in the park safely, and taking care of homeless people is second priority. In California and on the West Coast, somehow we've gotten this idea that taking care of this, in Butte County, it's 0.2% of the population who is homeless, but the priority seems to be, or at least it was, to take care of those people to the exclusion of everybody else.
Wow.
And that's wrong.
Wow.
And that's why we have homeless people camped, a lot fewer than we did, but camped in our public spaces.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're saying is this is a leadership problem. It's a policy problem.
Yeah, and that comes from leadership.
Right.
So in 2020, if you remember, we had the Brown New Deal. So we had homeless people camped everywhere. The city council at that time refused to let the cops, forbid the cops to intercede. And so people were just fed up and swept the city council out and put in a conservative city council in 2020 that has set out to change this and made a huge impact. But we're not there yet.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like it's a long road. It wasn't created overnight, but it just kind of appeared. It just slowly and surely over the last 10 years, it seems like it's just exploded.
Yeah, more like 20.
20.
Yeah.
Okay.
But when you have cities, the places that have lots of homelessness. So, I mean, there's two models for homelessness in the country: one that works and one doesn't work.
Okay.
So in the places that don't work, it's clearly not working in California. So I don't know if you saw the state auditor's report that said that basically we failed. We spent $24 billion in the last 5 years on homelessness. And the number of homeless people has grown 20% in one report I read and 40% in another report.
Wow.
In the last 5 years, right? If you look at places like Texas, they've reduced the homeless rate in the last 10 years by half. They've cut it, and they have 1/4 the rate of homeless per capita.
Wow.
And so there's three things that are different. You know, the first is it's still against the law. It's punishable to use hard drugs in Texas. In California, it's a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
And the police won't do anything because the DA can't or won't under state law prosecute it. It's a misdemeanor. You get a ticket if they get caught with meth, right? And you can steal $950 a day. So if you want to live in your tent, steal $950, buy your drugs, go hang out, you can do that. In Texas, if you get caught using hard drugs, you get in front of a judge and he says you can go to jail, you can go to rehab, pick one. We used to do that, but we don't do that anymore. So big surprise, homelessness exploded. And so that's one of the clear differences. In California, we're spending almost $12,000 a year per homeless person in state aid, and homelessness is growing. In Texas, they're spending $800. So we're enabling all this $24 billion in the last 5 years hasn't helped cure homelessness, which is how it was sold. It has enabled it and made it worse.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that is eye-opening.
But in Chico, we're off on a different path.
Okay. All right. Well, talk to us a little bit about this. So in Chico here, we see homeless people around because they tend to be in the city plaza or in Bidwell Park or just kind of around and kind of pretty public places.
Well, you have to remember, 3 years ago, there were huge encampments in Bidwell Park, at Depot Park, Comanche Creek, in the plaza. Those have been cleared out. Some of those people have trickled back, and we still have to go back and clear them. But what happened is in 2020, the council was elected to clear the homeless, reclaim our public spaces for the public, and they set out to do just that. They were sued by an outfit called California Legal Services that basically purports to represent poor people, but actually extorts money from cities. So they got paid almost $700,000 from the city of Chico.
Wow.
Sued the city of Chico. We ended up in front of a federal judge. The case law cited was Boise versus Martin, which says you can't tell somebody they can move unless they have somewhere else to go. And I'm okay with that. I mean, that's basic humanity. But the problem is, and by the way, right now in Chico, we have 25 vacancies at the tourist shelter and about the same at the pallet shelter. So we have over 50 empty shelter beds here in Chico. So the people that are out, you see camped outside here, are people who refuse to go to the shelter.
Okay.
And so that is because we're under the jurisdiction of the Ninth Circuit Court. There's 12 circuit courts in the United States. The Ninth has taken the view, this view, Boise versus Martin, that you have to have somewhere to send them. In the rest of the country, if you're camped, it's against the law to camp in a public space. And if you're camped in a public space, you have to move.
Yeah.
Period.
Period.
Right? So right now, today, this morning, this is Monday the 22nd, the case is being heard in front of the Supreme Court. Actually, it's a case involving Grants Pass.
Right.
And I'm encouraged because 79% of the cases from the Ninth Circuit that have been appealed to the Supreme Court have been overturned. So, and the Ninth Circuit is an outlier. The other 11 circuits have ruled differently. So we're very optimistic that we will have the tools to enforce the no camping rules and move homeless people out of our public spaces.
Wow. Okay, so let's go back to who finds themselves in homelessness. You've talked to a lot of homeless people. You've studied this for 10 years or however long. Who are the homeless? I mean, let's just.
Well, it's interesting. It's a mixed population, and so you have to be careful not to make generalities. There are people. There are old people and disabled people. There are people who something bad has happened. They got a DUI. They couldn't go to work because they couldn't drive their car. They lost their job and they ended up being homeless. So, but the largest demographic is, according to the pallet shelter, people sheltered there, are working age white guys. So the working age white men is the largest segment of the demographic. So the idea that the people are homeless because they're poor, sure, they're poor, but they don't map, the demographics of homelessness does not map to the demographics of poverty in the United States. So there are very few Hispanic people, very few Asian people, relatively few black people. And so one of the characteristics is, there's a survey that was done in San Francisco between the fall of 22 and the fall of 23 that Mark Benioff funded, about trying to really understand the population. And they interviewed 3,000 people. 79% of them had been incarcerated at some point or another. 79% of the homeless people they interviewed had been in jail.
Interesting.
So part of the reason there's so many homeless is in California, they decided we had too many people in jail. That was inhumane. So they just opened the jails and let them go. Well, guess what? They're camped, in our public spaces now.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I've never heard that statistic.
Well, and so when in parts of the country where you see lots of homeless, there's three things that exist, and they're related to policy. First is housing costs. So California has the most expensive housing in the country, and we have the most homeless people. They are linked. When you go to Alabama, Mississippi, Kansas,
Oklahoma,
they have almost very, very low rates of homelessness, but housing is cheap, so people can find a place to live. The second thing that exists in places with a lot of homeless is that the states have decided, a bunch of well-meaning people, to remove what I call the guardrails of civilization. So most people, you obey the rules because you know it's in your interest long-term to do that.
Right.
But a lot of people, if there's no punishment involved for doing something bad, they'll do it.
Right. If you could steal $950 a day and not
so
have any consequences.
Yeah, if there's no consequence for stealing and there's no consequence for using hard drugs, I mean, when there used to be consequences and people did it, and you take the consequences away, it shouldn't be a surprise they're going to do more of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got high housing prices and no enforcement of quality of life, things like drug use and theft, and you've got a lot of homelessness. And it exists in Oregon, it exists in Washington, exists in Hawaii, New York.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So you can see the generalities in those areas. Okay. So in Chico, how many homeless people? Did they know what the population? You said it's 0.2% of the total population. I mean,
well, it's very hard to get real data because these people move around. But every year in January, they have what's called a point-in-time survey. I'm sorry, it's December, point-in-time survey. So the one that was done in December of 23, they counted a little over 1,000 people in Butte County. I couldn't find the number for Chico, so a little over 1,000 people in Butte County. Chico has half the population of Butte County, but we have more than half the homeless because it's a nicer place than the rest of Butte County.
Yeah.
Of that little over 1,000, 580 were unsheltered. So let's say there's 400 unsheltered people. Now, currently, Torres Shelter houses 142 people, and the Genesis Shelter houses a little over 200. So we've got 350 people that are in shelter that would be on the street if it wasn't for those wonderful people.
Yeah, and it seems like the private sector and the public sector has both made a lot of effort to help homelessness. I think of like the Jesus Center and the Renewal Center. These are kind of privately funded, initiatives, and then we have the Torres Shelter, which is more kind of government grants and things like that. It seems like everyone's trying to supply the needs of those who want help. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the Jesus Center in particular, if you remember, they used to be a soup kitchen.
Yeah.
So basically, you could just show up and get a free meal, and
use drugs.
and that was and unfortunately that enables homelessness, right? It just helps people be homeless who would have no motivation because they can eat, and why not? So their director at the time, a woman named Laura Kutsona, said, I don't want to help anybody that doesn't want to help themselves. And then they started the Renewal Center. So in order to go to the Renewal Center, you have to be committed to get on a track to get your life back. And it's a fabulous program. Took a huge amount of vision and a ton of money, and they got it done.
Yeah, which is amazing. It's all privately funded from people from Chico, primarily giving because they care so much about helping people.
Yeah, the Hignalls were huge contributors to that.
Yeah. So where do the homeless people come? Are these people that are naturally grown? They went to Chico High School, they went to PB High, and they're down on their luck, or is it like, are they coming from all over the place?
Well, that's another one where it's hard to pin it down. So the homeless advocate people. So first of all, the homeless people are asked, where do you come from? And they all say Chico because they're coached to say that, right?
Okay. Coached by who? Who coached?
Coached by the homeless advocates. The people who claim to be compassionate but enable these people to die in their tents at 5 times the rate of the rest of the population. I mean, they're murdering these people by not. Anyway, that's another conversation.
Okay.
So if you talk to the homeless advocates, they'll tell you they're all locals. If you talk to the police, who I tend to believe who are more credible, they say that more than half are from out of town, and we know that there's sort of a circuit. They go south in the winter and they go north in the summer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Yeah,
like geese, right?
Follow the weather.
But I think some, and a lot of it is what defines somebody being a local. Is somebody who's lived here 6 months or 5 years, or was you in New England? It would be if your grandfather wasn't born here, you weren't a local. Mm-hmm. But if you say, let's say it's a year, I think somewhere around half of the people are transient, and the other half are local. Now we had a big influx. Remember the Paradise before the campfire was a big affordable housing area,
Yes.
and
Yes.
there was a lot of stuff that was built out of spec, and people were living in shacks and backyards, and so that provided a lot of affordable housing, a lot of mobile homes. When that burned down, those people came down the hill, and it put a big burden on our homeless increase in our homeless.
So, are there still people who are burned out of the campfire who are living on the streets?
They've probably they've settled down. I mean, a lot of them dispersed to other areas and went to neighboring communities, or they went back. There were a lot of older people, retired people in Paradise. A lot of them went back to live where their kids were, in Maine or Kansas or somewhere.
Okay. All right. So in Chico, why do we have this problem here? Like, why? I mean, is the city council? I mean, I think we've made a lot of headway, but the issue is still there. What's the underpinning reason behind that?
Well, earlier in the conversation, we talked about how in 2020 we elected a conservative council. They started clearing out the camps. They got sued. We ended up with something called a settlement agreement that is governed by a federal circuit judge. And next to God, they have more power than anybody. I mean, they can decide what happens. And so we have a set of rules that we agreed to in the settlement agreement. We can only clear 3 camps at a time. We have to give 17-day notice. One of the things that's been a surprise in the last 6 months or so is we believed that once we cleared an area, it would stay cleared. If people moved back, we could summarily move them out. And we found that the judge came back and said, no, you've got to go through the whole noticing process again, which is 17 days and very cumbersome. So we're in the process of constantly clearing out these sites, and they're dribbling back. Now, the good news is that the Supreme Court is expected to have a decision in June, and if the underlying law changes, then we can go back and renegotiate the settlement agreement. And
with the federal judge?
With the federal judge, yeah. If the underlying law changes, city attorney's opinion is that gives us the ability to go back and renegotiate the settlement agreement.
Wow.
And that will give us much more latitude in clearing these encampments. We need to get our public spaces back, because once the homeless camp there, they destroy it for everybody else.
Right.
That nobody wants to go.
Yeah.
And you don't want to send your kid
down
the bike path when there's a bunch of homeless people there.
Right.
And I don't want to go down the bike path with a bunch of homeless people.
Yeah, I understand that. Okay, so what's our goal? What's the future? What's the vision look like? What's what's the vision of Chico in terms of homelessness?
Well, the way it works in the other 11 districts in the United States and Western Europe is that homeless people have a place to go, but they have to go there. They don't get to choose whether they go to a shelter.
Mm-hmm.
The priority has to be the welfare of the community, not the welfare or the whims of the homeless. So I want to get to a place where we have places for these people to go, whether they're campgrounds or shelters, and we have 50 empty shelter beds right now as I'm talking to you.
Wow.
But that the police have the ability to compel them to go there and not camp in our public spaces. That's where we need to be.
Okay, and that is all contingent upon this Supreme Court case that you were talking about earlier?
It could be. We don't know what they're going to come back with, but given that the Ninth Circuit is an outlier, we believe that it will be some version of better. But we don't know until they rule.
Okay. Okay, but that's the hope, is that we could say, hey, look, you can't camp in these public spaces. We have a place for you, and you must go there.
Right.
And doing drugs.
It's not an option.
And it's not an option.
Yeah, but the doing drugs thing and stealing, that's state. So we're very constrained by the state.
Right.
The rules that the state imposes on us. So Prop 47 is the stealing $950 a day, and the making meth, use of hard drugs, meth, for example, a misdemeanor. That's state. We can't, not much we can do about that. But what we can do is, I'm hoping, is move them out of our public. We need to reclaim our public spaces and get our town back.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's very nuanced and seems like somewhat
complicated. But it's simple. I mean, it really is at the bottom. At the difference between liberals and conservatives is the agency, the role of the agency of the individual. So what that means is your life is up to you. And you may be born with disadvantages, and it doesn't matter because you don't get a do-over, right? And so if you make excuses for people and you enable them to live a life of drug addiction and squalor and filth in a tent and let them die there, that's not giving them agency. In places like Texas, where they have much lower rates of homelessness, 1/4, they say to the individual, you have to get off drugs or you're going to go to jail. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's that, and that is the core philosophical difference. It's that simple.
You mentioned a couple times people dying in tents. Is it more dangerous to have policies? I mean, just terms statistically, where you kind of allow people to camp and do whatever they want versus something more like Texas? Like when you compare homeless people in California versus homeless people in Texas, I guess is the mortality rate higher in California? Do you know those stats?
What I know is that the mortality rate, the average homeless person dies at 49. The rest of the population, it's around 80. And that their death rate is 5 times the rate of the rest of the population. And part of it is drugs. They get so high that, they die of exposure. I mean, I do ride-alongs with the police, and we got a call, dead guy in a tent, and sure enough, it was 30 degrees. He's laying on top of a sleeping bag, no shirt on, and he'd been there for 24 hours and froze to death. And this is in Chico.
Wow.
Yeah, and so it's a tragedy for those people that are homeless, and we can fix it, but we have to have the will to do it and not just pander to people because it makes us feel good, which is what drove the policy up until 2020. But it's a lot like parenting. I mean, you know, when your kids are little, they're going to do whatever you let them do, and homeless people are sort of the same way. These are the lowest functioning 0.5% of the population, and if you let them steal and do drugs, they will, right? So unless you punish them for doing that to make them stop, they're going to die at 49 instead of 80. And
Wow.
that's our fault as a society, and we can fix it. And we're in the process of doing that in Chico.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure we could talk all day about this.
This is a long one, yeah.
Definitely. But I think you've answered a lot of really good questions and probably educated, you know, a number of people about, you know, the current state of homelessness here in Chico. So thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you.
My pleasure, Brett.
All right. We'll see you on the next one.